And Felix and Helen are the two stubborn evangelists you have to know, especially if you want to talk about this part, about developing for Windows 8, 60 million licenses sold and counting. So these are the two guys that you have to know in the Silicon Valley. You can talk to me, I'm from Seattle, but you have to fly up to meet me in person. So Felix, all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. So hi guys, my name is Felix. As Steve said, so I'm just like Hal, one of the startup evangelists in San Francisco. So my main job is to be out there, talk to startups, and more often than not help out with code. And one of the big areas I really like is JavaScript. And if you're liking JavaScript today, most of the applications, the real applications you're building, you know, the things that go beyond just doing some animations in jQuery, you would build on Node.js, which makes a lot of sense considering how big the whole thing is. And Steve just said it, especially with the uprising of NPM modules, there are so many things you can do, right? So just on the weekend, he was talking about the Twilio module, which is brand new, it's really shiny. I went out there and tried it out, and it's amazing. You know, with a couple of JavaScript commands, you can have someone call you, you can have an automated voice talk to you, you can do amazing things. And that is just one small example. There are more amazing modules out there. A couple of things I want to talk about for the next couple of minutes are, number one is, we just saw the very basics, the very low-level basics. How do we actually deploy that? How do we get that, what we just did, into the cloud? How do we push things into the cloud and make it actually accessible to the whole world? The next thing is, once we've done that, I'm going to focus a bit on modules actually. Something I'd like to call the anatomy of a Node.js project. So what does a Node.js project actually look like, right? How do we set it up? How do we integrate modules? How do we make sure that all the pieces involved actually are aware of all dependencies, install the dependencies, and at the end of the day, we don't run into any conflicts. Something that is very important. Then I'm going to do a quick demo with one of my favorite modules, which is going to be Share.js, just because it's blazingly simple. It's essentially, I see a large Chrome logo over there. It's essentially the thing that powered Google Wave. Do people still remember Google Wave? Some of them here. And some amazing things about concurrency and live editing. You know, I don't know if you guys still remember that. There were some very neat features in there. I don't really know the whole story, but some of that code made it out there as part of Share.js. And it allows people to use Node.js to do concurrency, do live editing, fun things. So we'll try out Node.js and Share.js and just see how we can use that to build something that is very much along the lines of Etherpad, multiplayer Notepad, things like that. And then we should probably mostly be done. If for some reason I still have time left, I'm going to talk to you people about the file system, which is fairly important considering most of you are probably web developers, right? So raise your hands, all the people who've never built anything online. Cool, that is what I expected. So let's do the other way around. Who has ever done anything with a file system in JavaScript? We have two hands, which is to be expected, considering that most environments do not allow JavaScript to actually access the file system, right? That is to be expected. However, if you're building proper backend systems, if you're building proper applications, the file system is one of the basic building blocks that you need. So in Windows 8 and a couple of other things, you do have access to the file system. In Node, we do that, just like many other things, with a module called FS, short for file system. So if you have time for that, we will check that out. Okay, so let's start with deployment. Something I have here, something very, very simple and basic, is something Helen already explained. This would be the equivalent of a hello world, right? So let's just see if we can increase the size here a bit. So we just run a hello world server, something very simple. And if I do that, I would do that locally. That is rather simple. So that would be this one. If I open the Powershell here and just tell the whole thing to launch, I see that my server is running and can actually check it out. So I can go ahead. Look at this thing locally running, which is not really that impressive or cool in any way. However, I have multiple ways of getting this thing into the cloud. And when I say cloud, naturally I mean Windows Azure, and that would be a very important point. I've been told that most of you, or basically all of you, already have an Azure account set up. Is that correct? Do you people have access to Azure?
Not yet.
No. Not yet.
Yes.
So we should probably talk about how you guys get access to Azure. So, if you're so inclined to get an Azure account, for instance, because you want to run stuff in the cloud, you can set up an account on windowsazure.com. The amazing thing is Windows Azure has multiple tiers, things you can do, right? The very low-level tier would be virtual machines, where you can run your own virtual machines and take care of all the stuff. We have services in there like media publishing, media services, data storage, blob storage. But more interestingly for this session, there's also something called websites, where in a very simple environment you can do one-click publishing to get a WordPress website, or in our case, set up a very simple Node.js application. The nice thing about this is that it's free, right? There are a couple of trials you have available to check out the whole thing, but even more importantly, websites. There's a free mode for websites. So, if you go to windowsazure.com and you're not logged in, you have this button on the upper right that asks you to try the whole thing out for free, which gives you a couple of credits so you can just play around with things. If you are a startup, come and see on me, because we can do a bit more than just a free trial. But more importantly, as long as you have an account, you have free websites, which you can just run and deploy for free. On top of that, in addition to that, once you've signed up with those things, you get the Windows Azure portal. And I think in GitHub there are a couple of instructions how people actually sign up step by step. Or do you want to do that now?
We'll do it later, so
okay.
We'll pay attention.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. I prefer that. So, as soon as you signed up, as soon as you guys have an account, you have access to something that is called the Windows Azure Management Portal. This is my portal. There are a couple of things running in there, including my very own server, but also a couple of websites. And there are multiple ways now how you can actually deploy your stuff. So right now we have a couple of files on my local file system. I want to get those files up into the cloud. If I go to websites, I see that I have a couple of things running here. And the simplest way to set a new website up would be to just use the management portal. There is a way to use the command line, which is something I will use in a couple of seconds. But since most of you, I hope, are not actually coding on a typewriter or a terminal, but rather on something that has a visual interface, it makes sense to use a browser to set up a new website. So if I go to new, I have the option of creating a new website. I'm going to go with quick create here. Just give the whole thing a name. Right, so I can see that the name is available, that is convenient. I can also choose a region. In this case, I'm going to go with West US, because that is where we are currently. As soon as I click create website, it's going to take a couple of seconds. You can see right now it reads creating in the status. And in a couple of seconds I will have my website available. So there we are. It's running now. I can actually open the thing. And it's not going to tell me that much apart from, hey, have fun with your new website. So now the interesting part, and something that I think is amazing. There are multiple ways of getting your stuff up to the cloud. Number one, something I would recommend to everyone who's running Windows would be Webmatrix, which I'm not going to showcase today. But Webmatrix is, for many reasons, a very powerful IDE, especially for Node.js. It's completely free, and it has Azure Publishing integrated. So if you're running Windows, you should code in Webmatrix just because it's so awesome, so simple. And there's a small button on the upper left. As soon as you click it, it takes a couple seconds, and you will have your stuff online. The other two options would be to use either command line tools, take out the whole publishing stuff yourself. And the third option, and that is something I want to showcase here, is use source control. There are many of those available, and something I just found out is apparently that we added Dropbox as a source control, which I will not try out with you guys live because I didn't have the time to try it out yet, but it looks amazing. So if you go into the individual website, right now I'm on the dashboard, and since Azure knows that I just created the website, it's giving me a couple of options to do here, just a couple of tips. Hey, do some things with your website, and one of them is integrate source control. And something I can do here is set up deployment from source control. So as soon as I click this link, I'll be given a couple of options. Team Foundation Server, for instance, right now in public preview is our very own free management software to manage essentially software development in a team, right, with everything that is involved there, Scrum, all those things you can do. We also have things like Codeplex, GitHub, Bitbucket, and also Git. Later on I will use Git, because Git is probably the most open standard we have today. But for the moment, just because I think it's so cool, I'm going to go with Dropbox. So as soon as I click Dropbox, Dropbox asks me whether or not I want to give Azure access to my Dropbox, which I'm going to allow. So there we are. And now consider publishing. I'm going to go with a new folder. I'm going to call it Azure Workshop Test 1. Azure's now doing some thinking, which is essentially let's link the whole thing up. And if Dropbox is nice today, it should be so smart and just give me my folder. I'm just going to make sure that Dropbox actually runs here. Alright, so that doesn't actually work like I hoped it would. Oh, there we go. So the whole thing is actually live. That is cool. So if I go into my Dropbox now, I have this folder apps in Azure, and in Azure I have a couple of folders. One for the website I just created, which would be FR-Azure Workshop Test 1. Right now the folder is empty, just kind of lame. And something I want to do now is I want to go back to GitHub, where I have my hello world. I want to copy the server.js and go back to the folder. Just put this in here, go back to my Azure website, and click the sync button. Do that. Once again, it's going to do some thinking. That was really, really quick. And now if I open the website, we should see, in a couple of seconds, we should see that the whole thing has been deployed. So there we go. Successful deployment, deployed by Dropbox. And if I browse, you see the same hello world that I just run locally. So that is kind of cool, right? Because that is probably the simplest way we can actually deploy things. Because from now on, I can just put things into my Dropbox, hit the sync button, and it's going to be fine. Other things I'm just going to show you guys because I think it's important to know because it's awesome. If I go back to the dashboard and I decide to disconnect from Dropbox because I for this very moment want to lose the connection to Dropbox, I want to set up another source control, I want to set up another deployment method, would be GitHub, which is probably by far the most popular code management software right now.
If you're using like modules, does it also automatically sync?
I will talk about that, but the answer is yes.
Okay.
I will talk about it because there are multiple ways Azure does sync modules, but I'll talk about that in a moment.
So if you had multiple JavaScript files, would Azure load all the JS files in this instance?
So right now, as far as Dropbox is concerned, everything that is in here is going to be uploaded.
Okay, so
doesn't mean that it's going to run, right? I can put pictures in there of kittens, which is not going to be a server, but it will be uploaded. So that is the way.
I mean, it definitely started executing. That's how you made the call, right? So if you uploaded the server.js, Azure basically kicked in, or I mean, Node kicked in on the server and started.
Yes, so server.js is usually.
So in case if you had 10 files, they just all 10 would start.
No, they would not start. So the whole server.js being the main entry point is kind of standard right now.
You didn't put that anywhere.
Pardon?
You didn't put server.js as the main file any place. As the
True, but it's kind of like default HTML. In the very same way that Node assumes if it finds the server.js, that is going to be the file it runs, right? If you go with things like app.js, you would have methods of running that yourself. But usually you would define the entry point. If you don't want to define the entry point, right, just like you do with index.html, usually you don't configure your server to open index.html first. Right? You don't do that.
So any file name is server.js, which is considered as the main file.
Okay, so I just unlinked it from Dropbox. So that means the button that just read unlink from Dropbox now reads setup deployment from source control. I get the very same screen I just got. And if I go with GitHub in this case, I'm getting a very similar window. That the thing that just opened would have asked me whether or not I want to sync up Azure and GitHub, which I just allowed. And I can now choose a repository. In this case, I'm going to go with the Hello World repository, which I created. Which contains the very same code we just talked about, right? So the Hello World example. So if I go with the Hello World example here and confirm that, Azure once again does some thinking. going to think about it for a moment. If not, I can try to force it by going with sync. Deployment failed. Yeah, sometimes these things don't work perfectly as expected. That is alright. It's still like GitHub a lot. But essentially, GitHub is just one alternative to actually using Git yourself. I don't really know why GitHub right now doesn't really like my project. I can try to look in here.
Did you push?
I maybe didn't push. That might be the issue here. Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I just set up the repository. Okay, so we try that again. Yeah, that looks much more like a project. So we fixed that by actually putting files into the repository on GitHub, and once there are files in there, Azure automatically realizes that and updates the deployment. Something that is of note here is that as soon as you push something to GitHub, Azure within a couple of seconds will realize that and will also update your project.
Wait, so how do they know that you're using Node, not something else?
Because of server.js.
Okay.
Also, ideally, something I will talk about in a couple of seconds is you would use a file called package.json, which includes things like where to actually start with my application. But usually Azure would parse all your files and try to understand what the heck you're doing. Right? Trouble.
Also, like, what database did this support?
That really depends on what kind of technology you're using. So right now, if you think about Node, right, there are a couple of modules that you can use to run databases in Node.js or something that is similar to a database. There's no database installed right now. There's not something, you can't actually do MySQL something because you don't have a MySQL server. However, if you set up a MySQL server, go ahead, go wild. There are a couple of things we recommend. There are things like Azure Tables, which is essentially our SQL solution online. If you want to do Redis, something like that, if you would, or MongoDB, thank you, brilliant example, go ahead and do that. We fully support you in doing that. However, that is something you would have to set up yourself.
Okay.
Not because we don't want to set it up, but just because that is the best way to do it in the first place. All right. So, once again, just to prove that the whole thing worked, if I go to browse again, I will still see the same hello world. So those would be the, and you can probably picture that the other deployment methods using Bitbucket and GitHub I showed, and Team Foundation Server and all those things work similarly in the same fashion. Like you set it up, you sync those applications, and then you're happy. However, if you want to do the same thing the hard way being the terminal, that is something you can totally do. Let me just walk you through the process we're doing here. So instead of using this portal, something I want to do is I want to open up the Powershell, or if you're on a Mac, terminal. And I want to run the whole thing myself. So let me just go back to my Gits here. Hello world. So if I start PowerShell here, there are a couple of things I can do now. And the main thing is I want to start off by making sure that all my Azure tools locally do realize what kind of account I have and how I work with my account. So because I already worked a bit here, something I want to do first is I want to start with the command Azure account clear. We're just going to do nothing but deleting all the information that I already put in there. Because most of the time, here's how it's going to go down. I will use Azure, the command Azure, and all the commands that go with it, but I won't actually take care of all the passwords and all the accounts because I do that once using a file that is called the published settings file. There are multiple ways of downloading that. If you're in the Azure command, if you're in the Azure management portal, there are multiple links on all kinds of places where people ask you, hey, do you want to download the published settings file? However, since I want to stick within my terminal, I can just go with Azure and download. which is going to open a browser, automatically do all those login things for me, and is offering me to download my things. So if I go with save here, and open folder, I do see that I just successfully downloaded my publishing settings. I'm going to delete this one, and this is the stuff I just downloaded. I have a couple of publishing settings here. And if I go to rename, I have a file called settings.publishing settings. So now what I want to do is I want to import this file, and something that shouldn't shock anyone is that the command is rather simple. It's Azure account import, and then the essentially the full path of the file, right? So let's copy the file path here. Yeah, that might be easier. Right now, my little thing here seems a bit awful, but that works. Okay, so once I enter, there are a couple of informations about the things that just happened. Mostly, yeah, we did find a subscription. Yeah, the whole thing works. Yes, we can use it. Let's go ahead and do things with it. So once I've done that, I can actually go ahead and use all the Azure command line tools. And one of those command line tools would be that I want to create a new site. So if I go with Azure site create, I can give my new site a name. I want to create a new website. I can call it, I don't know, So that would be the most basic command I can use. And as you can see, since I omitted all the parameters, it's not going to ask me how I want to do this. So for instance, where do you want to choose? Where do you want to put the whole thing? I can go with the Node.js, which would be 3, and it's going to create a new website. Once I've done that, I already successfully created a website. However, since I want to use Git publishing, I can do something else, which is create a website and automatically make the folder I'm currently in the Git repository and link that up with the Git repository on Azure. Right? Something that I think is rather cool. So if I do the same command with another name, but add --git as a parameter, hit enter again, it's going to do essentially the same thing. Let's give it a couple seconds here. But it's also going to set up Git.
Git locally or GitHub?
Git locally. Git locally. You need to install Git though. So this is only going to work if you actually install Git, right? Which is fairly important. However, if you install Git, this is something that works beautifully. So something I can do now, since I'm already in the same folder, is I can just go with git add dot, which usually would add all files, because this is already a Git repository and didn't actually change anything. It didn't do anything to my files. But that is the command you would run to make sure that all the files in that folder are in your local repo.
Can I just add one clarification that that trips people up a little bit about Git? When we talk about Git, there could be two things that we're talking about. One is local Git, which means installing the Git executable on your local machine, developing it, and then pushing the Git from your machine to Azure. The second Git we're talking about is GitHub, like Git, which means your source code is already living in the cloud, and then from the cloud you push to the cloud. So that's GitHub. So when you are installing some of this stuff, you may have to choose local Git, which means it installs the executables on your cloud.
And there's at least 2 different ways to install local Git, Sigwin and native. I assume you mean native?
Yeah, the one that runs right here.
Yeah.
So the exercise that we'll go through today, and I think what he's showing is local Git. Right?
Yeah.
He's doing local Git right now.
So actually there are 3 ways of installing it, but essentially the way I want you guys to think about it is Git is a protocol for the guys who don't really know Git. And there are multiple ways of doing Git. GitHub is just one of the services offering you Git, right? Very much like Bitbucket. And what I just did here with this one command is I set up a local repo on my computer that I can manage locally. And also at the same time, I set up a Git on Azure that is linked to my site. So something I can then do is, and this is the important part, which is why I'm doing the git add dot here, is if I want to now publish the whole thing, I can just go with git push master to Azure, Azure being the remote repo, so the repo I'm now pushing to from my local repo. And once I enter,
You have to commit first?
yeah, maybe we need to commit first. So now we push the whole thing. I need to put in my password, something you would define online once you set up your account. And as you can see, something that's happening now, we're updating the things in the remote repo. The remote repo being the Git on Azure, right? And as soon as that happens, we can actually go into the website. Let's check this out here. So test4 being the website, and if I look at that, once again we get hello world. So those would be the three main ways of publishing things I would recommend. So Git for the people who actually know what they're doing and like to use Git, right? There are certain trade-offs when not using Git, but you should be aware of those trade-offs, which is my recommendation. So if you're using Git, it looks kind of fancy because you're using a terminal and you have all those fancy commands, but you should probably know why you're using Git if you want to use Git, right? If you're not doing that, GitHub is perfectly fine. So is actually Dropbox, right? Especially with Node.js applications. Do you guys have any questions about it? Yes?
Question about one basic from GitHub. Could I just have a local directory structure on my machine which syncs directly with GitHub and not have a local Git repository on my machine?
That is totally fine. In that case, you wouldn't set up Git, but you would set up GitHub. The very same way I just did it. So I can just show you guys that again very briefly.
So you don't need to set up a local Git repository. You directly use GitHub in the cloud.
Yeah, so funny thing about that actually is if you have the GitHub thing on your local machine, you already have Git, which is something that...
The GitHub client, you mean, the GUI.
Yeah, the GitHub client is actually Git. It obscures the whole thing for you, but that's essentially the same thing. So GitHub is very neat in the way that you don't need to worry about it.
Just kind of cool. It installs.
Yeah. So I would recommend for people who like to use some basic source control but don't really want to worry about doing the commits with the command line themselves, go ahead and use GitHub. It's amazing. If you don't want to use GitHub, go with Bitbucket or go with Team Foundation 7. Those are probably the easiest ways of having the whole blame feature, right? Knowing who fucked up the code, and at the same time being able to easily publish things online. All right? Any more questions about deployment on Azure so far? Brilliant. So
I started posting the video of the Git deployment from Node.js to Azure. I'm setting up to the email, but in case you were one of the standby guys, I'm going to post it on my Twitter account as well, so you have no choice but to follow me now. It's at Steve Seow, SteveSeow. So I'll post the link and you get it. So later on, if you want to repeat what Felix showed, you can watch the videos. Not the same.
Let me do a quick poll here. How many of you guys are using Git? Like command line Git? That is quite a lot. How many of you are using GitHub? Interesting. Alright, cool. So I think we'll be fine with that. Go ahead and use Git. It's amazing. Sure.
The node modules, if I'm using a lot of node modules, I don't want to push it to the Git. Can Azure, while deploying, can it install those?
Brilliant question. Let me move on to my next topic, which is handling modules. That is excellent. Let me just move on to that. So, something I want to briefly talk about is essentially the anatomy of one of those projects. So usually, here's how we recommend setting up a project. You would have a couple of files in there. And this is, no one is forcing you to do it like that, but this is kind of how it has been established. So a couple of things we have here. And the first thing I want to mention is package.json. How many people know about package.json? No one. One hand. All right. Package.json is a super important file. If you're thinking about node modules, the reason package.json has been around is for NPM, the repository for node modules. It's a requirement there, and it allows people to define in very easy terms what kind of project they're working with. This would be the easiest way, right? Just 3 lines, just some basic metadata. We have a name, we have a version, we set whether that's private. Package.json can be quite extensive, and something that will usually be included as the very basic same JSON determination would be the dependencies, right? So as soon, and here's the interesting part, as soon as you have dependencies in there, but you don't actually have those modules installed, Azure will pass those and try to install the modules for you, right? So that makes a lot of sense, and depending on what kind of boilerplate you go with, there are so many Node.js boilerplates out there, Package.json will be more extensive, less extensive. There are actually interactive package.json builders. But if you want to save those couple of megabytes by not having modules inside your folder, go ahead, use package.json, use its metadata possibilities. Azure will try to install things for you. Something I will have to say there at this point is that that you will clearly have more work making sure that Azure installs the exact package with the exact version you want to install than by just having the module in there. Because when you do it internally yourself, you can test it out locally, you can make sure that everything runs fine. Right? So that is one benefit of just using Git, because you can just upload things locally from your machine up to Azure. So that would be package.json. A couple other things we have here. README.md, mostly famous because of its markdown capabilities, and very famous because it's used like that on GitHub. So whenever you see any text on GitHub, that would be usually the README.md in markdown. We recommend using it because we promote clean code, and we promote people working together without killing each other, and documenting your code in a way that is understandable by your fellow human beings and your fellow coders. Make sure that you guys get along well. So we heavily recommend using README files. Now about the folders themselves. We have a couple of Git files here, which are usually hidden. I just made them visible to make you guys aware that they're around. They determine what kind of files you want to upload, what kind of files you don't want to upload, things like that. Also a bit of metadata that Git uses to make sure that your project is being handled well. Let's talk about the folders. Source, sourcing, being the file where you would usually actually have your Node.js code. Right? Test, being the folder where you would usually have your unit test. Unit testing in Node.js. We won't actually talk about unit testing today, or will we? We don't.
May not.
No, we will not talk about unit testing in Node.js today. And the only thing I can leave you with, once you become Node.js masters and wizards and build the most amazing applications out there, at some point you will find yourself in a state of, I should do unit testing, because that is going to ensure clean code. We recommend doing the unit testing in a separate folder and just keeping the whole unit testing part from your actually source code. And then the most important folder for all the people interested in node modules being node modules. A folder that is usually being created by NPM itself. What is NPM? If we talk about modules, usually we mean npm install, name of module, right? So if I just go into this thing and run the PowerShell here, and just go ahead and think about installing a single module. As Steve said earlier, there's so many modules, so many of them are amazing. Something you just mentioned, I'm just going to install Twilio. Just a shout out for Twilio here, an amazing company handling phone calls for you. So whenever you get a phone call, I think Hal mentioned that Airbnb is using Node.js, right?
I didn't mention that, but
You
that's
didn't
very
mention
true.
that. Yeah, Airbnb is using Node.js. And just so you guys know, whenever you get a phone call from Airbnb, you get the phone call, an extension from Twilio in Node.js. So if I go and then do npm install Twilio, npm now goes ahead, goes into the remote repository and downloads all the files that I need to actually have the Twilio package with me. And something that is kind of cool is that if I now go into my node modules folder, I find the Twilio folder there, which in itself is usually set up like a Node.js project. So once again, we find node modules, right? And that will go down infinitively, right? As long as there are dependencies, you will find the node modules folder. And also, you should find the package.json and the readme.md, which at the same time is a brilliant point to actually open a real-world package.json. Hoping that these guys did it well. They did not. Of course, so that would be a good example. There we go. So you can see here that there are a couple of things defined that are more extensive than the thing I defined. But for instance, you have a repo defined, you have dependencies defined, you have dependencies defined for the development, and something Azure would do, if you actually don't have a node modules folder within this folder, it would look at this file and try to install the things using npm. Okay? Cool. So, going back, we just installed Twilio, and something I want to do now, I want to show you how to work with one simple package. And one that I really like would be Share.js. Share.js org, it's kind of neat, it's extremely simple, and essentially allows people to do something called Etherpad, multiplayer notepad, things like that. So let's do something funny here and let's try to build this whole thing. So the very first step usually would be that I go ahead and do an empty folder. And what I would do now here is I would run PowerShell and go with npm install share.js. Well, I think it's actually share, sorry, install share. And npm now goes ahead, downloads the whole thing, gives me all kinds of dependencies. There we go. I don't see any major issues. That seems to be fine for the most part. Yes, awesome.
For each application you download NPM packages, is there a common repository on your machine, or are they all for each application?
NPM would be the repository.
Okay,
So NPM usually uses the... You can actually see what kind of repository it's trying to use. So if we go back to the PowerShell here, you can actually see that it would be registry.npm.js.org.
But on your local machine, where is it? Each application is having separate the JS files, or is it going to a common location on your laptop right now?
Sorry, are you talking about the repository or the files?
Once it's downloaded the files.
Okay, so once it downloads the files, it's handling a very simple file structure. It's always going to be Node modules by the exact application requiring this module. Which is why, if I open Node modules and check out share, I will find Node modules once again, because share.js itself is using dependencies. And if I go down there and I go and look at, let's say, connect, once again I will find Node modules, because connect in itself, you see, we could continue this forever. The whole point being, it's always going to be a very simple file system structure, but Node modules handles the dependencies.
So there are chances of your application using a dependency and share using another dependency, so you have two sets of files, or would it somehow?
Yeah. That would be exactly how it would be done. So let's say you have two modules and both have the same dependencies, you would have those files twice. For very simple reasons, to be honest. And that would be that the convenience of having it that way clearly outweighs the cost of another couple of kilobytes, because we clearly live in times where, so you know, hosting stuff on Azure websites is free, and for you guys, virtually, kilobytes cost nothing.
What if there's a loop,
What kind of loop?
like a dependency loop?
I don't think that actually can happen, to be honest.
Okay.
Because usually at some point you just go down to a level where you don't have any dependencies anymore.
Okay.
Because, and here's why, very simply. A module cannot require a module that itself requires your module. You could probably build that. I think you could technically build that, but NPM wouldn't allow that. But that's an interesting point. Thank you. Okay, so we just created this very, very simple thing. Something we want to do now, we probably want to go ahead and make sure that we run a server. And I'm just going to go here and look at the documentation, and the getting started documentation, because setting up one of those servers is super, super simple. So this is essentially very much like the hello world example we just wrote. So if I create a new text file in the folder we just created, called server.js, there we go. I can make sure that we have a very simple server. And something you will notice over here is that I require two modules, one being connect, the other one being share.js. Connect is something we will, in a couple of minutes, we will all talk about, once I let the stage, we'll talk about more advanced methods of actually setting up the server. But connect is just one of those modules, which code essentially I should also install. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm also going to install connect in the background. However, as far as Node.js is concerned, making sure that you have a module in your application, it's quite simple. You go with the require, you use require, use the name of the module, and if you want to use functions already, you can use functions after that. So for instance, what you can see here is that I just required the whole connect module, but share.js, the variable, the whole object for me is require share.server. So in this case, I'm making sure that I'm talking about the server, right? Let's look at the rest of the code. It should be fairly simple. Something I'm doing here will be number one. I'm setting up the server, setting up the logger. Connect.static is a very simple command you guys don't need to worry about. It's essentially saying, hey, instead of putting together our response ourselves, just go and use this folder, which is simpler, right? So that is one of the first modules people build, making sure that you can actually do the whole index.html file without worrying about it. And then the other thing you do is you make sure that you attach that server to, you use share.js to attach that server to your share.js function, and then you run the server. So, something you want to do now to make the whole thing complete is set up a public folder. It's in your folder here, public. And we should probably have an index.html file in there. So I'm going back to the documentation. Actually, let's not build the index.html file, we'll just use something that I have locally because that is already going to work. If we now need to publish the whole thing, which we can quickly do, briefly do. It should be easy. So, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go with Azure Azure site create. I'm going to call the whole thing share.js, Azure demo. And I'm going to set up Git, just make the whole thing simple. There we go, adding all the files to Git. Fine. Okay. Then do a commit. Okay, so there we go. And publish the whole thing. So there we go, we already published the whole thing. I can now go back to my Azure thing, to the management portal, look at all the websites I just created, and ideally I would have the ability to check out my websites and just create one of those running share.js servers. And the way I can do that is, we have a couple of things here, let's give it a couple of seconds to realize all the things we just created. One of them being share.js Azure demo. So the server itself is running, it's not really doing that much. Because right now it's not showcasing any kind of files, it's not doing anything that is available to the GUI, it's just providing an interface, and that would be the share.js interface, which enables people to do live concurrency. And something I already set up and prepared, because we don't really want to go into building HTML websites, would be a very simple website that is basically connecting to that server, right, to any kind of share.js server. And you can, I'm very briefly going to show the code here. I'm using the client counterpart, right? So something we have is share.js.open, which would be the client counterpart. So on the backend on the server we have share.js.server, here we have share.js.open, and those two parts work together. And if you guys, very briefly, do me a great favor, this is with audience participation, very briefly open multiplayer notepad.cloudapp.net, and start typing things in there, we can see that we all type together, managed by Node.js. And the amazing part about that is that we just use like 10 lines of code in Node.js. And the rest is being managed by all the module itself. Yeah, only one person typing here, this is outrageous. All right, so you can see, this is kind of cool, right? So we can see that multiple people are typing in the same window. And the code we just used was like 6 lines of code. Could be shorter. All right, that would be me using up my time, talking about modules and the structure of the project. Do you guys have any more questions about all the things we talked about so far? Nothing. All right. So something I would just want to mention. So just in this case, I'm going to use my last couple of minutes just to very briefly talk to you people about the file system, and then I'm going to vacate the stage. And that would be how we operate and interact with the file system. And we do that in a very simple way, very similar to Share.js, right? So if we want to do concurrency, we would go with Share.js. If we want to do file system, we would go with the file system. One big difference is that FS, the module FS, in opposition to all the modules we install using NPM, it's one of the native modules. So it's something that is already being, it's part of Node.js. You don't actually need to install it. You can just require it. So if you see the first line of code, something I do there is just requiring FS, and from that point on, I can use the object FS to access its, I think it's around 60 methods to work with files. Couple of notions about working with files in Node.js. 2 things I want to point out. One is you have all the basic methods you would expect. That would be open, does a file exist, can we read to a file, can I get a buffer from a file. There's also something that I think is very cool, which is a watchdog, watching a file that is going to throw an event as soon as something happens with a file. But the more important part is that all those methods are available both asynchronously and synchronously. And that is there for convenience, right? So if we look at the code on the lower end here, something I do is I read a file. This would be the way you do it if you have a user interface. This would be the way if you don't have a user interface, which is too broad, but one of the reasons how you can do it, because whenever you have a backend and you're doing very simple things and don't want to be bothered with asynchronous methods, you can use the synchronous methods, which make sure that your code is being run in order as you type it down. However, I would recommend that if you have the minute to spare, go with the asynchronous methods. Asynchronous coding is usually cleaner. Make sure that things work. So, as you can see, we have very simple methods. One of them would be read file for reading a file, which is part of the FS object, and have read file just as the normal read file, which would be asynchronously with a callback function. Error being an error and data being the actual data that I just read from the file. And the very same method is also available as a synchronous file, with the difference being that this line will be run only if this command executed successfully, whereas everything I write below the asynchronous file, the asynchronous method will just be run after, as soon as the method has been started. Something I put down on the upper area is just a couple things you can do with FS, just using as much as possible. That will be checking whether or not the file exists, right? If it does exist, let's get, open the file, let's do a couple things with it, let's get a buffer, let's read from the buffer, let's log some data, and let's close the file stream. So that would be working with the file system in Node.js. FS is usually one of the modules that is more difficult to understand because it's just so uncommon and unused to JavaScript developer to actually interact with the file system. And I do realize that just going, hey, the module name is FS, here's how you do it, is kind of like throwing you guys into the cold water. But at the end of the day, this is how you do things, right? So I would have used up all my time. I have 2 more minutes for questions if you guys have any.
Does this editor have IntelliSense to fill up the functions required for the file?
Sublime Text does have not. Visual Studio and Web Matrix do.
This one doesn't. Sublime.
Yeah. Because as far as Node.js is concerned, something that is kind of tricky is, here's something that's really tricky about IntelliSense and just autocomplete. How the object fs looks like will be defined by this command. However, unless you don't run this command, your autocomplete has no idea what's in there. Web Matrix does, the version 3, which is amazing. Yes?
Are there any modules to read from database like jQuery, or what do you use to just do a basic SQL or a NoSQL access to databases?
Very honestly, usually you would use the REST API that is being given by your database. So most of the time, the database question popped up a couple times. On Azure, all our databases, and now that the same is true for Amazon and a couple other our competitors, if you have a database and you have a database in the cloud, you would also have some kind of REST API that uses all the methods to secure the connection to the database and do all the things using REST.
It returns JSON from the REST job.
Yeah, essentially yes, because
You can
Node.js is basically built on REST, right? The whole thing is kind of the king of the REST kingdom. And yeah, so most of the time you wouldn't actually use a native module to interact with databases. However, that doesn't mean that people have done that. And for instance, a lot of the things we talked about, which are part of the Azure framework and things suggested in command line, for instance, stuff like that. There's also accessing databases and creating websites and creating blob storage in there. Microsoft, for instance, did decide to do a Node.js module. So all those things you would usually do in command line, you can also do in Node.js. So there are JavaScript commands for, hey, let's create another server, right? Things like that. But for databases, especially considering a project, I would usually suggest, personally, I would do REST. But that of course depends heavily on your scenario.
Cool. Felix, thank you very much.